We are living in a complex geopolitical landscape where a new Cold War is developing amidst economic interdependence and the weaponization of trade. Welcome to the latest chat about geopolitics and trade episode of the Sea Trade Maritime News podcast. Our host today, Punit Oza, founder of Maritime NXT, will be guiding you through a conversation on how the evolving New World Order impacts shipping and trade. And I'd like to hand over to Punit.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Welcome to another episode of my chat on geopolitics and trade. This is always a pleasure to actually host some amazing experts in this field. Today is no exception. I've got Professor Athanasios Platias, who is a professor emeritus of strategy at University of Piraeus. He's also the president of the Council of International Relations Greece, an Athens-based think tank and coordinator for Europe for the Mackinder Forum, which I am also very much closely involved with. He received an MA and a PhD in international relations from the Department of Government at Cornell University. He has been a Ford Foundation Fellow at Harvard University, a MacArthur Fellow in International Peace and Security at Harvard MIT, and a NATO Fellow. Professor Platias has held several senior advisory positions in Greek public sector over the last 35 years, served as non-executive directors in publicly listed companies for more than 3 decades, several academic positions, Dean of School of Economics, Business International Studies, Chairman of Department of International and European Studies at University of Piraeus. He's also author of numerous books and articles, and his research and training focus on 4 principal areas: grand strategy, geopolitics, and geoeconomics, something which we are very keen to learn more about, international security, and leadership. His last book on strategy, it's called Theocyrides on strategy. I think it's a twisty word for a non-Greek to pronounce, but basically it's about grand strategies in the Peloponnesian War and the relevance today. He's writing another book which should be out very soon. It's called The Art of Strategy, 50 Maxims for War, Politics, Business, and Everyday Life, written, co-authored by Konstantinos Koliopoulos. Professor Platias has actually been interacting with me in multiple areas, and it's been a complete pleasure to actually have him on my podcast. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you for the invitation and thank you for the kind introduction.
Professor Platias, so we're going to go through a slew of topics which I think are all extremely interesting. Based on the last interaction that I had, Professor, with you at the Institute of Chartered Shipbrokers event in Athens, you made an amazing presentation in terms of looking at the whole history of geopolitical developments and competition, how it fits into what is happening today, and more importantly, what might actually be happening going forward. You also linked it to shipping, to geo-economic trends, to even shipbuilding, to shadow fleet, and eventually we will talk a little bit about the new energy equation which has been formed because of the current Iran conflict as well. So my very first question is really about trying to understand the history, the big picture, the drone view of where the geopolitical competition today is. As you mentioned, you talked about it from an old Cold War versus new Cold War perspective. And according to me, that is a great starting point for people to understand where we are and how we have got here, and from where do we actually launch our further discussions. So please, Professor, the big picture, history of geopolitical developments.
Before I comment on the old versus new Cold War, I would like to start with the 3 big changes that are taking place in the international system. The first is power transition due to the rise of China. So at the top of the international system, we have a bipolarity because of the geopolitical competition between China and the United States. And this is different from the old geopolitical competition during the First Cold War. And there are 3 important differences. In the old Cold War that started after the end of World War II until the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had 2 blocks that they were very solid: an oceanic bloc led by the United States and its allies, and the Soviet Union, with its allies. The competition was mostly geopolitical. Uh, it was a period that the two blocs, they did not have a lot of economic interaction, and uh, and they had very tight control over its allies, the two dominant powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, in the new Cold War, this is changing. The new Cold War is taking place after a period of globalization. This period of globalization that started with the fall of the Soviet Union and the beginning of the first Trump administration, it was a period characterized by American unipolarity that facilitated what we call globalization, of easy movement of capital, of goods, of people, of ideas. Now, with the beginning of the new Cold War, that, as I said, started with the first Trump administration and continued with the Biden administration and then in the second Trump administration, we had three important differences compared to the first Cold War. The first one, as I said, it's economic interdependence. The second is the alliances are not tied anymore, and mid-range powers like Russia, India, Indonesia, Brazil, Turkey, they exhibit strategic autonomy. And the third difference is that the first Cold War took place in a static position in the continent, in the Central Europe, and now it takes place in the sea. If you see, all the important flashpoints today are around Eurasia, but in the seas surrounding Eurasia. For example, the war in Ukraine has destabilized the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea. The war in the Middle East has destabilized the Eastern Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and the Persian Gulf. And the broader geopolitical competition between the United States and China uh, has the potential to destabilize the South China Sea, East China Sea, and the Arctic. So, as you can see, the geopolitical competition takes place around Eurasia in the sea. So, these are the three most important cases. Economic interdependence, which means that all things that were connecting the two blocks, energy, trade, supply chains, technology, are now weaponized. That's a big change. So, weaponization of relationship and competition at sea. Now, I also talk not only about power transition, but also power diffusion, because the mid-range powers, they're exhibiting strategic independence that are very important on their particular area. Let's say in the Middle East, Turkey, Iran, Israel are important on this context. India is important in another context. Russia is important in Eurasia, Brazil in Latin America. So you have at the very top a bipolar competition, but you have also elements of multipolarity. That's why it remains a system with many centers, multicentric. And then there is an erosion of sovereignty and the rise of non-state actors like Hamas, Houthis, but also economic actors like the techno oligarchs. I mean, you have companies uh, like Nvidia uh, or Microsoft that have capitalization that it's bigger than GDP of India, Japan, Germany, UK. So you see other non-state actors playing a role, but including individuals. For example, Musk controlling SpaceX is very important in order to wage war in our days. So that's why I call the international system hybrid. It's unstable and it's producing a lot of geopolitical instability due to these three elements that are described: power transition, power diffusion, and power fragmentation.
If you're enjoying the Seatrade Maritime podcast, make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing on the app of your choice.
Is it fair to say, Professor, that essentially it was the unipolar American domination with globalization from the mid 1990s till the first Trump term, which has given rise to the current multipolar, strategic, hybrid geopolitical space that is developed now? Because had that period of globalization not taken place, you would not have seen these new power centers emerge over a period of time. Is that correct or not?
Yes, I mean, look, there is a historical continuity
Exactly.
from a system that was strictly bipolar with very few interactions between the blocs, and the competition was mostly military and geopolitical, alliances and troops and nuclear weapons. That was characterized the First Cold War. Then we move in a period of globalization that the economies were tied. Globalization helped the rise of China and a lot of other centers that now are the middle range powers. You see, and this created this multi-centrism, many centers of power, but they coexist today. But what happened today is a bipolar competition return at the top, not between the Soviet Union, which collapsed, but now with the rise of China. I mean, the rise of China is so important. Let me give you a statistic. During the First Cold War, the GDP of the Soviet Union did not reach more than 42% of the American GDP. Now the Chinese economy is about 80% of the US GDP in nominal terms, and in terms of buying power, PPP, China has already managed to overcome the United States by about 27%. So you see, this explains the what I call the power transition from the west to the east and the rise of bipolarity at the top. But I cannot call the international system bipolar because of the other reasons that I explained. Because at the same time, you have power diffusion in different areas of the world and the rise of autonomous or middle range power and power fragmentation.
It's like two main opposition parties and then fragmented regional parties which have very big sways in their own regions, basically.
Exactly. And this makes the international system complex and unstable. But for the purposes of our discussion, the most important elements are two: that the competition is taking place in the sea. So the sea is a central domain of geopolitical competition. And second, every relationship built during the period of globalization, during the period of economic interdependence, has now weaponized. Energy has weaponized. Trade has been weaponized. The financial architecture has been weaponized. Investment has been weaponized. Supply chains have weaponized, and shipping has weaponized. So that's the two big differences compared with the old Cold War. Everything now that ties the two blocks is becoming a weapon. It's becoming an issue of national security.
Which we have seen, I guess, in the discussions, like even the American and Chinese deciding to hold it back for 1 year as a truce was basically because they realized that if their interdependency is so great, they cannot really decouple so quickly. It can create catastrophe in terms of trade.
Well, let me comment on precisely this point. The United States, under the second Trump administration, tried to use trade as leverage. Access of the Chinese to the American market was a weapon in the hands of the American government and tries to weaponize it with tariffs and with exclusions, but also with technology restrictions to China. Then how China responded? Playing, weaponizing supply chains and mostly the rare earths. So the two superpowers realized that all this thing was creating mutual vulnerability, and they tried it to reduce the geopolitical fever. But structurally, they still are competing. Let's put it this way: both have nuclear weapons. Both can destroy each other. Therefore, a traditional way of solving differences, war, it's not relevant anymore. So the competition is taking place below the level of war, which means political subversion, or which means efforts for technological dominance, but most importantly, weaponizing economic relations. That's why we have the rise of geoeconomics. So the competition, every country is trying, every superpower tries to place its competition on its competitive advantage. For example, China is dominant on the industrial sector, is trying to place the competition at industry. The United States is dominant on energy, so it tries to use its energy dominance as the prime weapon in this competition. So all relations from trade to supply chains to energy, everything that connects like the financial infrastructure, SWIFT, everything has been weaponized, and shipping at its all ecosystems, from insurance to whatever. So everything related to shipping is weaponized.
I agree, and I think that's where I can come to, because one of the first things that you have actually done, and unfortunately it's an audio podcast, so we can't really show the presentation or the picture that you drew. You have an assessment of security and geopolitical and risks per choke point, which is quite topical now given what's happening in the Hormuz, where you've taken all the choke points from Suez Canal to Hormuz to Bab el Mandeb, Malacca, Lombok, Mumbai, South China Sea, and East China Sea. And I will read out the categories with which you have put the risks. You've got great power rivalries, you got littoral rivalries, maritime disputes, internal instability, piracy and armed robbery against ships, terrorist attacks, and climate hazards. And in the Strait of Hormuz, Professor, you were bang on target when you actually mapped out the risks. Everything except maritime disputes is high to medium risks. In fact, most of them are high risks, and those high risks are coming together. So, how do you see these choke points being kind of quite, they are in some ways like what Iran is now talking about as part of their international, part of their domestic waters or territory, but at the same time they're also international seaways. How are the weaponization of these choke points creating these challenges, and what are the potential of this happening in other places? Because your same presentation graph tells me that South China Sea is all high, all medium, and no low risk there. Everything seems to be challenging there. Is that the next flashpoint for you?
Absolutely. Well, let's try to understand the logic. The dominant maritime power, the dominant naval power, the United States, it derives a lot of its strength by controlling the oceans, controlling the global commons. And by controlling the oceans, you control maritime trade. And as you know, maritime trade is about 80% of the global trade. Why? Because it's cheaper to move goods over the sea compared to air or land. Uh, so if you control the sea, the global commons, essentially you derive wealth. So the American hegemony rested on control over the seas, and control over the seas it also meant controlling choke points. Now this is changing. The Eurasian powers try to create areas that the American power can be denied. They deny access. This is happening in South China Sea around Taiwan, as you can see also it's happening now with the Straits of Hormuz, and last year or immediately after the the Gaza incident in the Red Sea because of the Houthis. Now, the beauty with the choke points is that they allow maximum leverage at minimum cost. Why? As I said before, 80% of the global trade moves via the sea, but 70% of this global trade moves via the choke points. So if you can control the choke point, if you can deny access, therefore you can have a maximum geopolitical leverage with minimum cost. Let's take some example. The Strait of Hormuz is more than 20% of global energy, 20% of oil and 25% of gas. Now, if you strangle this particular choke point, you just create a global rebalancing of energy. I will come into that a little later. Suez, about 12% of and the Red Sea, 20% of the global trade. Not global trade in general, which means that what happened after the Gaza incident and the Houthis attacked on the Red Sea, we had a reduction of trade by 70%. We had new routes coming out around Africa in order to connect East and West, let's say China with Europe. But at least in this case, we had an alternative route. In the case of Hormuz, there's not really a serious alternative route. Now, let me come to the Strait of Malacca. I mean, in South China Sea, there is trade more than $5 trillion per year, about one third of the global trade. And this was a very important vulnerability for China. I mean, the Chinese always fear that the US naval dominance can very easily control this choke point and essentially make it very difficult for China to have trade, to have imports of energy and raw material that were very important for its industry. And for that reason, just the idea that the Malacca Straits were vulnerable make the Chinese create alternative routes. And in my mind, the Belt and Road Initiative, the Silk Road, was to a very large extent a defensive measure by the Chinese in order to reduce dependence on the Strait of Malacca, and at the same time, creating new dependencies using geoeconomic indices. But it started from the basic vulnerability that the maritime route can be easily disturbed by the United States. Now, let me remind you also the importance of Panama, which essentially connects the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean. So choke points are important for the reason that I explained. Maximum geopolitical reverence at minimum cost. And the most explosive right now, of course, is the Strait of Hormuz. And the Strait of Hormuz is not really a regional issue. It's central to the geopolitical competition between the US and China. For example, the disruption of energy. Who is hurting? Asia. Is hurting the Asia standard, including China, that although China has a lot of buffers, I mean, it has backup plans with the Soviet, with Russia, it's easy to diversify in Central Asia, it has a lot of stockpiles, still it buys energy at more expensive prices and not discounts. And what is also happening, the Eurasia energy system is losing its power, and the Atlantic Basin system, mostly with the United States, it's gaining power. So what what you see in the Strait of Hormuz is rebalancing of global energy flows, and it also rebalancing geopolitical power in favor of the United States because of its energy dominance. So you see, it's not just a regional issue, it's a global issue, not only on its impact on the global economy, but also because it rebalances energy flows, energy power, and it increases the American advantage on energy dominance, which is weaponized, of course, against its opponents, but also against its allies.
Absolutely. But before we jump into the geoeconomic, the tariff part of it, because I wanted to understand that if the underlying aim of pretty much all these geopolitical developments, especially the Venezuela and the Hormuz combined together, is to basically reduce the Chinese dominance or influence, let's put it that way, from American perspective, and increase the American influence going forward, the trade flows that are rebalancing now with American energy exports increasing at a rapid pace and the others kind of dwindling or challenged in some ways, you think that will actually maintain that impact even past the Trump era, you think? Is because these are all long-term investments, by the way, and they will obviously have dependence building over the years, which will actually create trade flows for a longer duration.
Absolutely. You see, everybody's concentrating on Trump and is losing what's going on a bigger picture.
Right.
I mean, Venezuela, essentially, it gets under American control. And Venezuela is very important because it has 17% of the world oil depositories. Then the United States make an effort to control Iran. If the plan was succeeding and having a pro-Western, pro-American government, essentially the United States would have managed to control Iran. But with what is happening there in the instability, what you have? You have destruction of energy infrastructure, and you have difficulties of putting oil in the market. You see, it's not just important to have energy resources. You must have accessibility to put it in the markets. And now accessibility has been destroyed at the same time that energy installations are being destroyed, not only in Iran, but also in Iraq, in Kuwait, in Qatar, in Saudi Arabia. So you see a global restructuring taking place mostly because of the Eurasian system. And the Eurasian system, it's not only the Middle East, it's also Russia. I mean, if you look the war in Ukraine, and the attack of Ukrainians with American weapons and with American targeting on the Russian energy infrastructure, it essentially destroys part of the Russian energy infrastructure. I mean, Reuters reported that the Russians lost about 2 million barrels per day because of this destruction. Now, if you add what we are losing from Russia to about 21 million barrels per day that are being lost from the Gulf states, you understand why we have the biggest energy disruption ever. Much more than it's much more important that the 73 oil embargo that involved only 4 million barrels per day. Now the combination of Gulf and Russia, we are missing about 23 $1 million per day, and the so-called new routes to around the Gulf, for example, Saudi Arabia shifting oil to the Red Sea, or the United Arab Emirates, bypassing the straits. All this, the maximum that they put in the market is about 7 to 8 million barrels per day. So what we are missing from the global energy market is about 13 million barrels per day. And how the system is rebalancing? Two ways: demand destruction, but also the Atlantic basin and mostly the United States are benefiting from that. The United States, in the last month, exported 5 million barrels per day. So you see, it's a clear uh, energy redistribution, with losers the Eurasian ecosystem, and with the winners the Atlantic ecosystem, the United States, Canada, but also Brazil, West Africa, and Norway. These are the winners.
Absolutely. So I think this is something which can well continue beyond the war, from what I can imagine, because once you have these rebalances, it will take some time for people to even look at the options coming back. This might be very different. But let me come back, Professor, to one more area which we discussed also earlier, which is the tariffs. Now, the geo-economic weapons that are available earlier with the economies were mostly to do with protecting their own domestic industries or trying to subsidize some of the issues. But the President Trump's second term seems to have made it like a proper geo-economic, geopolitical weapon. Is this something which is going to actually maybe even teach a few lessons to the future US presidents, and probably even other countries like China and others who might follow the same methodology and start imposing sanctions or restrictions if they feel threatened by any of these actions? Is this becoming a new template? And obviously, this is impacting trade for the long term.
Absolutely. The way that you can see that in the broader geoeconomic competition is really not protectionism, but strategic filtering. The United States tried to move production back, the American government, I mean, back to the United States. What instruments it has? First, to create disincentives for trade through tariffs,
Right.
and then also give uh, uh, incentives to move industry back in the United States. So the idea and the goal is to reduce dependence on Chinese industry and Chinese supply chains, and increase control over supply chains, and to protect technology. And this actually has started with Biden. Although everybody is concentrating on Trump, actually it started in first Trump administration, it continued through Biden, and it continued through Trump. Therefore, it's a kind of much broader policy, and it's not related just to President Trump. So we see a rebalancing. We are moving from free trade to filter trade. And it's not only trade, it's all the infrastructure supporting trade. I mean, the financial infrastructure, and here comes sanctions. And here comes the weaponization of SWIFT. On sanctions, for example, it was a perfect instrument for the United States to use it economically against its competitor. Look, sanctions against three important oil producing countries like Venezuela, like Iran, like Russia. You see, these geoeconomic weapons completely changed energy flows, and the aspiration was to change also trade flows by moving trade either to the United States on shoring, or to neighboring countries like Mexico, near shoring, or to friendly countries like India, Thailand, Vietnam, which we call friendshoring. So you have at least an idea of rebalancing production, industrial production, and trade in order to reduce Western and American dependence on China, because China actually dominates industry. It has become the industrial locus of the world. The Chinese industry is producing double than the United States. And in the long run, this is a huge vulnerability. And by the way, this is also relates to shipping.
Shipbuilding.
Exactly. Let me give you an example. You see, in order to be the dominant naval power,
Right.
which is currently the United States, you need shipbuilding capacity.
Correct.
Now, the United States lost the shipbuilding capacity on the civilian level.
Sure.
And this has moved to allies like Korea and China, but Korea and Japan, but mostly to China. If you see the new orders, the Chinese are getting about 65% of the new orders for shipbuilding. So China is central on this. And you see, the shipbuilding of China, because of civilian and military fusion, has allowed the Chinese to build a fleet, a naval fleet, that it's bigger than the United States. For example, in the end of this decade, the United States will struggle to have 300 ships, and the Chinese will have 435 ships. You see, almost 50% bigger than the United States. And it's not only that, it's not the actual number, it's the latent capacity, the capacity really to mobilize in case of necessity. For example, the United States managed to win the World War II because of its industrial capacity to mobilize. Now, this capacity now has moved to China. So, if you look at the balances in the ocean, you have a rising power, China, managed to overcome the United States in actual shipping, in capacity to build more ships, in capacity of mobilization, and slowly started building an infrastructure around the world via ports to support it. It's not here yet. The United States has about 800 bases around the world, and then a lot of them are useful for maritime dominance. But you see, China is moving that way. So the United States are being challenged in the sea. And one of the responses to that is the so-called port fees. If you remember last year, the United States instituted port fees to Chinese built ship regardless of ownership, regardless if it was owned by a Greek ship owner or a Norwegian ship owner. And this became very important in the economic competition between the United States and China. And it was so important that when last October the Chinese president and the American president met in Korea, the Chinese demand were to the United States to stop tariffs or the threats for more tariffs, and also take back the port fees. And the Chinese were using the coercive leverage of the rare earths in order to get this result. And actually, they managed to do that. So, the President Trump had to withdraw the port fees and to withdraw his threat to increase tariff, because of the weaponization of supply chains and rearranged by the Chinese. So as you can see, shipping that was always geopolitical, now it's central to the geopolitical competition. Let's put it this way. If you control industry and you make products, you need to transfer it. And this transportation takes place in the sea, so shipping is as important as the production. The same thing with energy. If you control energy resources, but you cannot put it in the market, as useless. So you can see both trade and energy as an ecosystem, that shipping is part of it, is as important as production itself.
And that's where I think the shadow fleet is probably a very interesting example, that in order to basically deliver those cargoes which are sanctioned in the ways where the Americans are trying to exert their influence, there is literally the need for these countries to build the shadow fleet. And obviously, the conflicts in Hormuz and the Russia Ukraine war has also impacted the shadow fleet in some ways. But is that a trend you see continuing, and you actually see the potential of this being a kind of a trade which increases with time, because energy is going to continue to move? And if the sanctions are in place, then they just have to find other ways to move them.
Well, this relates to my first point about fragmentation. I mean, world order and the international system is fragmented. I mean, there is trade under Western rules, and there is trade under a different system that it's not Western. For example, in the energy trade, the shadow fleet is about 20% of the global tanker fleet.
Right.
This is huge. And it's natural to have the shadow fleets when you have sanctions against Venezuela, Iran, and Russia, which are three important energy producers. Now we don't have in Venezuela, but we have against Iran and Russia. So the system is rebalancing. These sanctions, they don't stop trade, they reroute it. And the shadow fleet is important to make this rerouting. So it's essentially uh, a continuation of the geoeconomic competition. I mean, the US in this case is using its financial architecture, dollar dominance, control of the movement of funds through SWIFT, but also insurance. So by controlling insurance and controlling the financial architecture, you take out of the Western market of a market that the West dominates
Yeah.
a big part of the fleet. So there is now a new structure based around China and Russia that they offer the financial architecture in order to move funds from crypto to barter trade to using the Chinese currency, but also insurance. So you see a fragmented market, one based around the West and one based around the East. So the shadow fleet is a good example of the side effects of the geoeconomic competition, because remember what I said. It's not enough to control, let's say, energy resources. If you cannot put it in the market, it's useless.
You cannot
So
transport them. Yeah.
if they make it difficult for you to put it in the market, you create other instruments. So what happened was natural. But this has other effects. I mean, the United States is responding with secondary sanctions. So the whole thing is becoming complicated. And you see now how the geoeconomic warfare is influenced particular companies and actually even owners at a personal capacity.
Sure. But at the end of the day, if we look at the current conflict, I can understand from, and you mentioned about this in your previous presentations that I've attended as well, that the entire adversary concept that was earlier between US and Russia during the first Cold War has now basically been redirected to China as the primary rival in this so called new Cold War. But there is also American ambitions which are seen in Venezuela, which are probably seen in Greenland, Panama, and Cuba, which is kind of trying to dominate the Western Hemisphere. And then, of course, you have the allies that they are bolstering in Europe and in Asia. At the same time, as you mentioned, you also have this stabilization of West Asia, and down the line you have the African, which is more like just a footnote in the national security policy. Now, when I look at this big picture of these different priorities that America has, how should shipping get impacted by this? What should ship owners think about when it comes to the future trade flows? What should be their strategy?
Okay, let's start with the big picture that you described.
Right,
The rise of China created a problem for the United States that was the dominant power.
right,
So it had to respond. How it responded to the Chinese rise. And the Chinese rise, by the way, is very fast and the momentum is favoring it. So it tries to consolidate power in the Western Hemisphere. And this means two things: increase US power and roll back Chinese power. What you saw in Venezuela is rollback of Chinese investment in the Venezuelan energy industry. What you saw in Panama with the two hands on ports, that under US pressure, the government of Panama essentially forced to nationalize, it's again an application of Chinese rollback for the Western Hemisphere. What you see in Greenland, it's essentially an effort for the United States to locate itself in a critical choke point, because with the melting of the ice and the polar route becoming relevant, access to the Atlantic goes through Greenland, and through Greenland, Ireland, and the UK, a traditional choke point during the First Cold War. So, what we see happening in the Western Hemisphere is the United States consolidating its power in order to compete with Russia. Then it tries to rebalance relations with the Europeans. And rebalancing takes place at two levels. The United States thinks that the Europeans are drawing American resources and they are useless in dealing with China. So the United States is trying to disengage from NATO and try to disengage from Europe in order to concentrate on China. But at the same time, it creates energy dependence of the Europeans, so LNG mostly, but also now because of the Hormuz incident, also on oil, in order to increase the dependence of the European and the United States and reduce its strategic autonomy. And then it comes to the Middle East. The United States is trying to create a new architecture in the Middle East that American allies, mostly Israel, but also Turkey, are dominant there, in order to disengage from the Middle East and leave it to its allies and to concentrate on China. So you see all the movements that you see in the international system has to do with the basic geopolitical competition that I described, the US-Chinese competition that it's instigated because of the rise of China. Now, how all this is impacting shipping? I mean, shipping becomes central on the geopolitical competition. It's becoming an issue of national security. As you can see, on shipbuilding becomes issue of the national security, and trade is becoming an issue of national security. Now, for shipping, this is a risk, but it's an opportunity. You see, every geopolitical disruption creates market inefficiencies. And the market inefficiencies is good for shipping. I mean, what happened with the Houthis in the Red Sea, they reduce traffic in the Red Sea, but increasing around Africa, which increased days and tons per mile. And the same thing is happening now with energy. I mean, short trips like from the Gulf to Asia are being disturbed by Hormuz, and you see oceanic trades, let's say from the United States to Japan or from the United States to Europe, are increasing. So also the rebalancing of energy because of the war in Ukraine, that energy was mostly flowing through pipelines, but now goes through LNG carriers. It was good for shipping. So geopolitical disruption, it's usually one of the fastest way to create wealth, and it's risk, but mostly opportunity for shipping.
Absolutely. And that's well put. But I just wanted to ask you, given the circumstances that you've described and given how America seems to be plotting its geopolitical moves around in, and also shipping is very much a part of that mix. As you say, it's useless to control resources if unless you're able to market them and ship them and put them into the market as such. Would this mean that the Trump grand strategy is working and America will be the place to go and bet resources for the shipping companies going forward? I know there is already Greek shipping companies who are listed in the American markets and they are probably having access to American businesses. But is this the kind of a period where we see a more tilt towards American growth and business and less Chinese influence, while still having influence in terms of demand aspect? But in general, it's America who's going to call the shots in most cases now, as it's trying to exert the geopolitical uh, power that it has going forward. I think Africa is kind of just by the side now, but the other parts of the world seems to be carving up for a fight, and the shipping companies need to be smart about this, I would say. Yeah.
Well, the United States is trying to rebalance the international system, but and it makes very clever movements. As I described before, the energy rebalancing is favoring the United States, that it has energy dominance. And by the way, energy dominance, it's very important on the technological competition on who will control the most important technology, artificial intelligence. So what the United States is doing, it's increasing its relative position in the competition with China. And China, for the United States, it's a huge competitor because, as I said, it managed to overcome the United States at the economic level, at least at buying power PPP, and has strong comprehensive power, and it's translating its economic power into military power, and has already managed to create anti-access and denial strategies in around Taiwan, but also in South China Sea. So China is a competitor, but when it comes to shipping, China is also important. I mean, China is the biggest manufacturing place in Earth. So a lot of trade emanates from China. So for the shipping industry, China is still important because of trade. And also for resources coming to China for its industrial capacity. So the whole rebalancing that is taking place make both superpowers central to shipping, and I cannot say that one is more important than the others. The United States is more important on disruption, which creates opportunities, because most of this geopolitical disruption that we have seen in the last decades was instigated by the United States. But China still it's important because of its production, because of its industrial production, because of its trade, and also it's important of energy. So you cannot say one is more important than the others. I mean, the ship owners and the shipping industry has to work with both of them, but the United States is creating the opportunities due to disruption. Disruption means economic inefficiencies. Economic inefficiencies means creation of wealth.
Absolutely, and I think the scale that China has reached now is just impossible to ignore it. So you are never going to get it out of the system. But let me end this by asking you a hypothetical question. In the historical times, especially when you look at Africa as a continent, the colonization of the African continent was basically dominated by some of the colonial powers. The French were there, the British were there, even some of the others were actually in there. And there is a clear understanding that a lot of these colonial powers knew their own regional influences, and they literally carved up and divided the various parts of Africa into their dominions or their colonies as such. Do you see the ability for, at some point of time, totally crazy idea of US and China calling it a truce permanently and saying there are certain areas where I would like to basically be the dominant force, and certain areas which I will leave for you, Mr. China, to go and have your domination. Let's carve up the world between each other and do it. Do you actually see that kind of a grand plan or a grand strategy being agreed between US and China? Stop fighting and just carve up the world between themselves? Sounds crazy, but probably has happened in history, right?
Well, yes and no. What you describe is a G2 world. I mean, the two dominant powers
Right.
in the top, the global two, the
Yes.
two superpowers that, as I said, have huge distance. There is a huge gap from the third power in the international system. Instead of competing, trying to cooperate.
Yes.
This would have been an ideal scenario, at least for them, because it would reduce competition. But what I see happening is exactly like Cold War One, that there is competition, but also some understanding. For example, understandings. For example, in the first Cold War, there were some understandings that the Soviet Union will have a zone of influence, which was essentially Warsaw Pact and but also Central Asia. And this zone of influence was respected. When the Soviet Union collapsed and NATO started expanding in the East, Russia in the beginning, make verbal uh, demands and trying to complain, but then, when it moved closer to Russia, it used military power by its invasion against Ukraine in order to stop it. From Russia, that was the West moving to its sphere of influence. So during the first Cold War, you had geopolitical competition, but also some rules of the game.
Right.
And the rules of the game was respect of zone of influence, but also make regulated the competition, mostly military competition, mostly arms races. So we had a lot of treaties in a kind of security regime that they were dealing with arms control, arms limitation, but also important agreements like the ABM Treaty that essentially institutionalized the MAD, the mutual assured destruction.
Right.
So the competition at the military level was regulated, and it was regulated because the two superpowers realized in the Cuban missile crisis that it was easy this competition to escalate into a nuclear war. Now, it's possible that the Second Cold War will move in this direction. Right now, we don't see that. We see unregulated competition. So there are two futures possible to imagine. One is continuing the geoeconomic competition because and the geopolitical competition because, as I said, due to nuclear weapons, we cannot have nuclear war. Therefore, the competition has to be political, geopolitical, geoeconomic, technological, but not direct war, only war by proxies, which is happening right now, because what we see is war by proxies. But at the same time, putting some rules. Oh, that's the good scenario. In other words, manage regulated competition because the competition will be there, which means going in a long range marathon and the stronger system will prevail. That's the good scenario. The other scenario is unrestrained competition, which will create instability and also risks for inadvertent escalation or escalation to direct conflict between these two superpowers. And Taiwan is probably the most dangerous point, but also South China Sea is a potential minefield, but also in the Arctic. And then you can have an unrestrained competition. So, in my mind, competition will continue.
Absolutely. And this sounds great. And I think we are out of time now. But, Professor, thank you so much. I would just like to say that you are also hosting the third Maritime Security Summit in Athens on the 28th of April, where I hope to be there. I will be there, rather. And I look forward to interacting with the participants. But also, this conversation has been fascinating. All I can say to conclude from my side is that the shipping community has to be ready for more disruptions unless this good scenario works out and there is a managed competition. If it is an unmanaged competition, unrestrained competition, shipping will continue to have these shocks and they will also have these opportunities which they need to try and capitalize. So, thank you so much,
That's all
Professor,
we have time
for
for
this
today on the
fascinating
Seatrain Maritime
conversation.
News
I really, really
Podcast.
enjoyed it.
Thank you for
Thank you
listening,
for
and we look forward to
inviting me,
joining
and
you
I'm
on the
looking
next
forward to
episode.
seeing you in Athens in a couple of weeks.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.